So, like many of the speakers, I too am an immigrant to Canada. My parents are immigrants to the United States. I've been in Canada for 45 years. I've never doubted at all the rightness of my decision to come to this country. Now, what I want to talk about, and I'm interested that we haven't had any of the other faculty members here talk, is about my international experience teaching, in particular, teaching in China. And I'm calling this It Ain't Easy, teaching leadership where leadership may not be wanted. Now, in this, August, I left Royal Roads right after my residency with my MA in Environmental Education and Communication students, and I went to China, and I taught for 2 weeks in Beijing at the Forestry University, 2 weeks in Tianjin at the University of Technology, and then 2 weeks in a crummy little commercial building in Hefei down west of Shanghai. And this was part of the Masters in Environment and Management's program that's offered in Beijing, Tianjin, and Hefei. And this was the last course that the students would take, and it was a course on sustainability and leadership. Now, I'm not a leadership scholar, and I'm clearly not a scholar about anything to do with China. So let me put that caveat out there first. I loved China. I loved the people I met on the street. When I loved this guy who offered me his baiju, and the people who would cook for me. Even this kind of grouchy guy who was a specialist in squid. I learned to say one sentence in Chinese, "Yi ping piju," one bottle of beer. That was the only sentence I could say in China, and it worked to get around everything else I could point to in food. I loved the people. I loved actually being in Beijing in spite of the bad air quality, and them being in Tianjin, and them being in Hefei. I walked every place. I got on the metros. I got on buses, and I found getting on the buses wasn't the hard thing. It was knowing when you're supposed to get off. That's hard. I loved most of the students. This was the group in Hefei, and they were by far older and more serious than some of the other students were. And we also had too much baiju. This is like 40 to 50% alcohol. Now, I teach the Leadership and Sustainability course here at Royal Roads to the MEM students here, and I'm not a scholar of leadership, but I found some people that I connect with. I found this guy, Joseph Ross, who wrote a book called Leadership for the 21st Century, where he talks about leadership not being a boss, but being an influencer. Not having authority, but being able to exert influence on leaders and collaborators who together want to make things happen. I like that idea of leadership. I also like the work of Ron Heifetz at Harvard, who talks about leadership without easy answers. He talks about leadership when you don't have authority. That leadership is about mobilizing and engaging people over folks, you have no authority to mobilize or engage them. I like that idea because I think for many of us, leadership is about mobilizing people that you have no authority over. Now that works for me here in North America. But China is not Canada. And when you look at the work of Geert Hofstede, a Dutch scholar who looks at cultural differences, when you look at China and you look at Canada, they rate really dramatically differently in things like power distance. So power distance is a society's willingness to accept asymmetries in power, that some people should have more power than others. In China, it's very accepted culturally, and in Canada, it's not. Canada is a highly individualistic society. China is a collectivist society. China is a society where people are willing to put off gratification into the future. In Canada, we want to have more fun right now than put things off. The cultures are not the same. So why would we think that our theories of leadership should apply in this very different context? So what my story to you is really a set of questions that I'll finish with, which is about my disquiet, ultimately, in what I was doing when I was in China. Now, not only are the cultures different, but how the cultures see leadership is different. So again, a group of scholars have looked at leadership behaviors in terms of 6 variables, from charismatic, team-oriented, participatory leadership to self-protective leadership. When you look at China, which is considered part of Confucian Asia, it's the red one. The self-protective leadership has those attributes up there. North America, Northern Europe, and the English-speaking world, it's completely different, isn't it? What we think is important, what the Chinese think is important, is down at the least important for our Western understanding of leadership. And what we think is pretty important up at the top there, well, it's down at the bottom here of Chinese understandings of leadership. So here I am, a Canadian guy going into China teaching a course on leadership, about leadership being influence and leadership being what you do when you have no authority, in a culture that is actually based very strongly and for 3,000 years very effectively around leadership is who has authority. Now, China is not an open society. It's an authoritarian society. There is a significant amount of repressive things that we would consider repression in China that goes on all the time. And so I'm teaching a course about influence. I'm teaching about about power. How do you deal with power? And how do you talk about, when you have no formal authority, how do you make changes? I mean, China is a society where when you go to Tiananmen Square and you look across to the Forbidden City and Mao's mausoleum, you're watched every place, every place. And in fact, the government of China, President Xi, is, we see things like this. We see headlines like this. There are things you're not supposed to teach in China. And I saw this. I saw one of the translators who translated for me was very uncomfortable with things I was saying. I could just see it in his body language. And I was sure at times that he wasn't saying what I was saying. And I don't know what he was saying. Maybe he was talking about the Baizhu and Yiping Bidzhu. I don't know. But these are the kinds of things that you're not supposed to talk about at a university in China. This is document 9. Look it up. You're not supposed to talk about promoting Western constitutional democracy in a classroom. You're not supposed to promote universal values of freedom and human rights, or press freedom, or the value of civic participation in civic society. And that's all I'm talking about in some ways. So at the end of it all, we're aware that leaders in China, if they're not part of the hierarchy, they're not exhibiting their appropriate authority, it's dangerous. Labor activists are arrested and sentenced. Lawyers who stand up and act in non-authority forms of leadership are arrested. President Xi warns of clique conspiracies and fraud. So at the end of it all, I really wonder whether the people in China who want our program to be taught there really want a leadership philosophy taught that fits our norms in North America, but may go counter to the Chinese norms. I really wonder if I teach in China what I teach in Canada, do I actually put the students at risk? Because China is a surveillance society, and I don't, and maybe even the students don't know actually who's in the class with them. And am I putting them at risk by saying things that should not be said? On the other hand, do I have the right to be culturally inappropriate when teaching in another country? Would it be inappropriate teaching in Stalinist Russia to talk about Western democracy and freedom and civic participation when Stalin might not appreciate that? It might be very inappropriate. Should I censor my teaching to keep in line with the Chinese government's desires? Do I not talk about what I learned was called the 3 T's? You're not supposed to talk about what happened at Tiananmen Square. And the students, for the most part, either don't know about it or they know they're not supposed to know. We're not supposed to talk about Tibet. And we're not supposed to talk about Taiwan. And in fact, out of respect, I guess, I didn't talk about the 3 T's. And yet Tiananmen would be a perfect example of a leadership failure, both on the part of the student movement and on the part of the government. And so to finish then, the question I ask as a teacher is, should I, and maybe even should we as a university, be teaching leadership in China? Thanks.